Have you ever wondered what might happen if someone who spent a lifetime protecting wildlife suddenly found themselves defending that mission on live television? That's exactly the kind of moment we're diving into today. Robert Irwin arrived on The View expecting to talk about conservation, endangered species, and the future of Australia's wildlife. Instead, the conversation quickly took an unexpected turn. What started as a routine interview slowly transformed into an intense debate that left the audience stunned, the hosts scrambling, and viewers arguing long after the cameras stopped rolling. Before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments whose perspective you agree with by the end of the story. Robert greeted the hosts with his usual calm smile and settled into the discussion. The opening questions focused on his newest conservation initiative and ambitious effort to protect crocodile habitats across northern Australia. He spoke passionately about preserving ecosystems, educating future generations, and continuing the work that has defined his family's legacy for decades. Everything appeared to be going smoothly. The host nodded along, asking thoughtful questions, while Robert explained how habitat loss and environmental change continued to threaten wildlife across the region. Then the mood shifted. Jo leaned forward with a more serious expression. "Robert," she began, "you spend your life encouraging people to protect animals, but some critics would argue that your family has also built a very successful media brand around those same animals. How do you respond to people who believe conservation has become part of your business?" The studio instantly grew quieter. Robert paused for a brief moment before answering. "I understand why people ask that question," he replied calmly, "but every project we've built has always had one goal: to support conservation. The documentaries, the educational programs, and Australia Zoo all exist to help protect wildlife and inspire people to care." Jo wasn't fully convinced. "But your work also generates revenue," she continued. "Doesn't that create a conflict?" Robert remained composed. "Conservation isn't free," he explained. "Protecting habitats, caring for injured animals, funding research, and supporting wildlife teams all require significant resources. If education helps generate those resources, then it allows us to accomplish far more than we otherwise could." Some audience members applauded. Jo pressed further. "So where do you draw the line between education and entertainment?" Robert answered without hesitation. "The line is simple. If an activity benefits the animal, supports conservation, and teaches people something meaningful, then it's serving a purpose beyond entertainment." The atmosphere became noticeably more serious. Several of the other hosts exchanged quick glances. As the discussion grew increasingly pointed, Jo continued, "Some people would still argue that your family's public image has helped build your career." Robert's expression changed slightly, though his voice stayed controlled. "My father's name certainly opened doors," he admitted, "but keeping those doors open requires real work. Conservation isn't something you inherit. Every day you have to earn people's trust by producing results." He described working with wildlife experts, conservation groups, researchers, and government agencies on projects ranging from habitat preservation to anti-poaching efforts. "This work happens whether cameras are present or not," he said. "Most of what we do isn't filmed at all." Jo listened carefully before asking another question. "But why keep putting animals on television?" Robert smiled slightly. "Because most people will never experience these animals in the wild. Television allows millions of people to understand why these species matter. When people understand something, they're much more likely to protect it." He explained that awareness often leads to donations, volunteer support, stronger environmental policies, and greater public interest in conservation. "It's a chain reaction," he said. "Education creates awareness. Awareness inspires action. Action creates conservation." The audience responded with another round of applause. Jo, however, still wasn't ready to move on. "Some would say you're simply very good at marketing." Robert nodded. "I hope we are," he answered. "Because if effective communication helps save wildlife, then marketing becomes another conservation tool." For a moment, the studio fell completely silent. The conversation had clearly evolved beyond a simple interview. Both sides were now defending to very different ways of looking at conservation, public influence, and media responsibility. And everyone watching could feel the tension continuing to build. The conversation had already become far more intense than anyone expected. The audience could sense it. Even the co-hosts, who had been eager to keep the discussion balanced, seemed unsure of where things were headed next. Joe leaned back for a moment before returning to the subject. "So let me ask this another way," she said. "If conservation is truly the priority, why make yourself the face of it? Why not let the science speak for itself?" Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath before responding. "Because science needs people willing to communicate it." His tone remained calm, but there was noticeably more conviction behind every word. Researchers do extraordinary work. Biologists, ecologists, veterinarians, they're the real experts, but their findings don't always reach the public. My job is to bridge that gap. He explained that documentaries, public appearances, and educational programs weren't about personal attention. They're about giving wildlife a voice. The audience applauded softly. Joe folded her arms. "But doesn't constant exposure create celebrity culture around conservation?" Robert smiled politely. "I'd rather people become excited about wildlife because of someone they recognize than ignore conservation altogether." He paused. "If a television program inspires a child to become a scientist 20 years from now, that's a success." Several audience members nodded. Another host stepped in. "Robert, you've worked with endangered animals since childhood. Has public attention ever made that work more difficult?" "It definitely has," Robert admitted. "People often assume what they see on television represents everything we do." He explained that cameras usually capture only a tiny fraction of the work involved. What people don't see are the endless meetings with environmental agencies, the habitat surveys, the fundraising, the rescue operations that happen in the middle of the night, or the years it can take to restore damaged ecosystems. It's not glamorous, it's just necessary," Joe quickly responded. "But television focuses on exciting moments." "Of course," Robert answered. "That's how storytelling works. But exciting moments bring viewers, and viewers become supporters. Supporters become volunteers. Volunteers become donors, and donors make conservation projects possible." He spread his hands slightly. "That's the reality." One of the co-hosts leaned forward. "So you're saying publicity is simply another conservation tool?" "Exactly. The goal has never been fame. The goal is impact." The audience applauded again. Joe wasn't finished. "The critics argue that handling wild animals in front of cameras can encourage irresponsible behavior." Robert nodded immediately. "That's actually an important concern." For the first time, both sides seemed to find a point they could genuinely discuss. "I never want people watching our programs to think they should approach dangerous wildlife." He explained that every film interaction follows strict safety procedures involving veterinarians, wildlife specialists, and trained professionals. "We spend far more time explaining why people shouldn't imitate what they see than people probably realize," he continued. "Every situation is carefully planned around the animal's welfare. The camera comes second. The animal always comes first." The audience responded with another round of applause. Joe looked thoughtful before asking another question. "But if your work depends on public support, isn't there pressure to create dramatic television?" Robert answered honestly. "There's always pressure in media, but conservation can't become entertainment at the expense of ethics. If that ever happened, we'd lose the trust we've spent decades building." His answer seemed to quiet the room. Another host smiled. "That's probably the clearest explanation we've heard today." Robert laughed lightly. "It's actually a simple idea. People protect what they understand, and they understand what they're able to see." Joe looked across the table. "I'll admit something. I still have questions, but I appreciate that you're actually answering them instead of avoiding them." Robert nodded respectfully. "I've never had a problem with difficult questions. I only believe they should begin with facts." There was another brief silence. The atmosphere had shifted. The sharp back and forth was beginning to resemble a genuine discussion instead of a confrontation. But everyone in the studio could tell the debate wasn't over yet. Joe had one more topic she clearly wanted to explore. She leaned forward once again. "Let's talk about accountability." Joe rested her hands on the table and looked directly at Robert. "Let's talk about accountability," she said. "No matter how respected an organization is, shouldn't the public still question how conservation groups operate?" Robert nodded almost immediately. "They absolutely should." That answer seemed to surprise everyone. I've never believed conservation organizations should be beyond criticism, he continued. In fact, accountability makes good organizations stronger. Joe raised an eyebrow. So we're finally agreeing on something. Robert smiled. I think we've always agreed on accountability. The difference is how we approach it. He leaned forward slightly. If someone has evidence that we've done something wrong, I'm happy to answer for it, but criticism should come from facts, not assumptions. The audience listened carefully. Robert continued. Our financial reports are public. Our conservation projects are documented. We work with government agencies, independent scientists, veterinarians, and environmental experts. None of this happens behind closed doors. One of the co-hosts jumped in. So transparency has always been part of your mission. Absolutely. When you're asking people to support wildlife conservation, trust is everything. Joe wasn't entirely convinced, but the average viewer doesn't necessarily know all of that. Robert nodded. That's fair. And perhaps we can do an even better job explaining how conservation actually works. But that's different from assuming something unethical is happening simply because people don't know every detail. The audience applauded again. The discussion had become less emotional and more thoughtful. Even Joe seemed to slow down. She glanced toward the audience before asking another question. What frustrates you the most about conversations like this? Robert took a moment before answering. It's when people reduce years of conservation work to a headline. He looked around the studio. Protecting wildlife isn't one television episode. It isn't one social media post. It's thousands of people working together for decades, he described. Wildlife rangers spending weeks in remote locations, researchers collecting data in difficult conditions, veterinarians treating injured animals through the night, and volunteers dedicating countless hours without expecting recognition. Those people deserve the spotlight far more than I do. The room became noticeably quieter. Another host smiled warmly. That's a perspective many people probably don't hear often. Robert nodded. Conservation has never been about one individual. It's always been about teamwork. Joe listened carefully. Then she asked one final question. If you could change one public misconception about your work, what would it be? Robert answered without hesitation, that conservation is only about saving animals. He paused. It's much bigger than that. When you protect a habitat, you're protecting water sources, you're protecting forests, you're protecting entire ecosystems that people also depend on. He continued, when wildlife disappears, it's often a warning that something much larger is happening. So conservation isn't just about nature, it's about our future too. The audience broke into applause once again. For the first time since the interview began, the tension seemed to disappear. Joe looked at Robert for a moment before speaking. I may still have questions, she admitted, but I respect how strongly you believe in what you're doing. Robert smiled. And I respect anyone willing to have an honest conversation. One of the co-hosts took the opportunity to wrap things up. Before you go, what's one message you'd like viewers to remember? Robert's expression softened. You don't have to travel across the world to make a difference. Support local conservation efforts. Learn about the wildlife where you live. Reduce waste. Protect natural spaces. And most importantly, never underestimate how much one person's actions can inspire others. The audience rose to its feet with warm applause. As the cameras pulled back, the atmosphere felt completely different from the one at the beginning of the interview. What had started as a challenging exchange had ended with a broader conversation about conservation, responsibility, and the importance of asking difficult questions with an open mind. Whether viewers agreed with every point or not, one thing was undeniable. The discussion had put wildlife conservation at the center of national attention, and perhaps that was the most valuable outcome of all.